The radio went dead at 7:14 in the evening. Not with static or interference, but with absolute silence, the kind that falls when a heart stops beating. In a bunker buried beneath the frozen forests of East Prussia, 23 men stood motionless around a wooden table, waiting for words that would never come. The voice of the Sixth Army had spoken its last. Stalingrad had fallen. Adolf Hitler stood at the head of the table, his hand pressed flat against a map that no longer mattered. For 3 months, he had promised that Stalingrad would hold. He had forbidden retreat. He had refused evacuation. He had promoted Friedrich Paulus to field marshal just 2 days ago, knowing that no German field marshal had ever surrendered, believing this would force Paulus to fight until death or take his own life. Instead, Paulus had chosen to live. He had surrendered 91,000 German soldiers to the Soviets. The unthinkable had become real. Werner Hoffmann, a young adjutant of 24 years, stood near the door with a notebook in his trembling hands. His job was to record everything the Führer said. But Hitler said nothing. Minutes passed. The room grew hotter as bodies remained frozen in place, breathing shallow, eyes fixed on the motionless figure at the map. Werner had witnessed Hitler's famous rages, tables overturned, voices raised until throats went raw, generals humiliated with screaming accusations. He had prepared himself for that storm. What came instead was worse. Silence. Complete and terrible silence. General Kurt Zeitzler, chief of the Army General Staff, finally stepped forward. His face carried the gray pallor of a man who had not slept in 4 days. He held a folder containing the final casualty estimates. Over 800,000 German and Axis soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured in the Stalingrad campaign. 24 generals were now Soviet prisoners. The entire Sixth Army, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, the force that had conquered France in 6 weeks, had ceased to exist. Zeitzler opened his mouth to deliver these numbers. Hitler raised one hand without looking up. Zeitzler closed the folder and stepped back. Werner watched the clock on the wall. Its ticking seemed louder than artillery. 3 minutes passed. 5. 8. The candles on the table flickered from the breath of men too afraid to move. Outside, winter winds howled across the East Prussian wilderness, carrying temperatures of -20 degrees. Inside, the room felt like a furnace. Sweat gathered on Werner's collar. Still, no one spoke. Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, stood in the shadows near the far wall. Werner caught him watching not Hitler, but the other generals, studying their faces, noting who showed fear, who showed doubt. Bormann's eyes moved like a predator tracking wounded prey. Even in this moment of catastrophe, the political calculations continued. Werner understood then that some men see disaster not as tragedy but as opportunity. At 11 minutes, Hitler finally moved. He removed his hand from the map and straightened his posture. When he spoke, his voice carried no anger, no grief, no passion at all. It was quiet, almost gentle, like a teacher explaining a simple lesson to a slow student. Paulus was supposed to become immortal, Hitler said. I gave him that chance. I made him a field marshal so that history would remember his name alongside Frederick the Great's generals. He could have died a hero. His men could have died as legends. Instead, he chose to become nothing. He chose to let his soldiers become slaves. Werner wrote every word, his pencil moving automatically while his mind struggled to process what he was hearing. 800,000 casualties, and Hitler spoke only of missed opportunities for glory. The mathematics of death meant nothing. Only the story mattered. Only the legend that could have been. Hitler turned from the map and walked slowly toward the door. The generals parted before him like water around a stone. As he passed Werner, their eyes met for just a moment. Werner had served the Führer for 2 years. He had believed in the mission, in the destiny of Germany, in the genius of the man who had rebuilt a broken nation. Now, looking into those pale blue eyes, he saw something that shattered everything he thought he knew. He saw a man who was not grieving for the dead. He saw a man who was angry at the dead for dying wrong. Hitler paused at the door. Without turning around, he spoke once more. Clear the room. Bormann stays. Everyone else, out. Now. The generals filed past Werner in silence, each face a mask hiding thoughts that could mean death if spoken aloud. Werner was the last to leave. As he pulled the heavy door closed behind him, he heard Hitler's voice resume inside, asking a question that would echo through his nightmares for years to come. How do we make the German people understand, Hitler asked, that death is better than surrender? The door clicked shut. Werner stood alone in the cold corridor, his notebook clutched against his chest, listening to the muffled sounds of two men deciding how to turn tragedy into propaganda. Outside, somewhere to the east, 91,000 German prisoners began their march into Soviet captivity. Most would never see Germany again, the war would continue for 2 more years. But something ended that night. Werner felt it in his bones. The dream had started dying. And he had just watched the first shovel of dirt land on its grave. The telephone rang at 3:17 in the morning, dragging Joseph Goebbels from a dreamless sleep. Within 90 minutes, his private plane was cutting through frozen clouds toward East Prussia. By dawn, he stood in Hitler's private study, looking at something he had never seen before, the Führer surrounded by handwritten pages, composing words like a man possessed. "We will give them a funeral," Hitler said without looking up. His pen moved across paper with furious speed. The greatest funeral in German history. For soldiers who are not dead. Goebbels understood immediately. The surrender had happened, but it would not be acknowledged. The Sixth Army had fought to the last man, that would be the truth. Paulus was dead, that would be the record. The 91,000 prisoners marching into Soviet camps would simply cease to exist in German memory. History would be rewritten before the ink of reality had dried. 300 kilometers away, in a military hospital outside Berlin, Werner Hoffmann walked through wards filled with broken men. These were the lucky ones, soldiers evacuated from Stalingrad before the final collapse, pulled out by the last transport planes in January. Lucky, Werner thought, looking at the stumps where legs had been, the bandages covering burned faces, the 1,000-yard stares of men who had seen their friends eaten by rats because the dead could not be buried in frozen ground. He found Sergeant Klaus Brenner in Ward 7, a former schoolteacher from Hamburg who had lost 3 fingers to frostbite and gained memories that would never fade. When Werner introduced himself as an adjutant from headquarters, Brenner laughed, a hollow sound with no joy in it. "Headquarters," Brenner repeated. "Tell me, does headquarters know what horse meat tastes like after the horses are gone and all that remains is leather boiled with snow? Does headquarters know what it means to watch a man freeze to death standing up because he is too weak to lie down?" Werner listened for 2 hours. Brenner described the final weeks in Stalingrad, the ammunition that stopped arriving, the food supplies that became a memory, the Soviet artillery that never stopped falling. He described Field Marshal Paulus sitting in his basement headquarters, following Hitler's orders to hold until the last bullet, while his soldiers gnawed on their own boot leather outside. He described the moment when everyone knew no rescue was coming, when the promised relief forces became a lie no one bothered to believe anymore. "They told us to die for Germany," Brenner said quietly. "But Germany stopped sending us bullets to die with. So we surrendered to live. Is that cowardice? Or is cowardice sending men into a trap and refusing to let them escape?" Werner had no answer. He wrote nothing in his notebook. Some truths could not survive being written down. Back at the Wolf's Lair, Goebbels crafted the official narrative with surgical precision. Werner arrived in time to witness the final rehearsal, Goebbels practicing his speech before Hitler and a small audience of loyal officials. The words were beautiful. The words were lies. The Sixth Army had achieved immortal glory through their heroic sacrifice. They had fought to the last cartridge and died standing up. The Soviets had merely captured corpses. Every sentence was designed to transform defeat into mythology. Hitler interrupted only once. When Goebbels mentioned possibly awarding Paulus a posthumous Knight's Cross, Hitler's fist struck the table. You cannot honor a man who chose to live as a slave, Hitler declared. Paulus had one duty, to become a symbol. A field marshal of the German Reich does not surrender. He fights until he falls, or he takes his own life. Paulus did neither. He chose his comfort over his honor. He chose his miserable existence over the glory of his men. I gave him immortality, and he spat in my face. Werner's pencil froze over his notebook. The mathematics finally became clear. Hitler had promoted Paulus to field marshal not as a reward, but as a trap. The promotion was meant to force Paulus to die, because a living field marshal who surrendered was unacceptable to the mythology Hitler was constructing. Paulus had refused to play his assigned role in the story. His survival was an insult to the script. That night, Werner learned that Brenner's ward was being relocated, transferred to a facility far from Berlin where journalists would never find them. The embarrassing survivors would be hidden away, their testimonies buried, their truths erased. The funeral for men who were not dead would proceed without witnesses who might complicate the narrative. Werner faced his first real choice. He could warn Brenner, giving the sergeant time to disappear before the transfer. This would be treason. It would risk everything, his position, his family, his life. Or he could stay silent, following orders, remaining safe within the machinery of lies. That he thought of Brenner's missing fingers. He thought of the frozen men who died standing up. He thought of Hitler's cold blue eyes. Before dawn, Werner slipped back to the hospital. He found Brenner awake, staring at the ceiling. "Leave tonight," Werner whispered. "Go to your sister's house. Tell no one. Trust no one." He was gone before Brenner could respond. As he walked through the frozen streets, Werner felt something shift inside his chest. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The machinery of the Reich had lost one small gear, and no one would ever know, but Werner would know. And that would have to be enough. The voice crackled through 10 million radio speakers across Germany, and in a small kitchen in Munich, a woman named Ingrid held her breath. She had not eaten in 2 days. She had not slept in 3. Her son Hans had been with the 6th Army, and for 6 weeks she had heard nothing, no letter, no telegram, no official word of any kind. Now the Führer himself was speaking about the Eastern Front, and she leaned toward the radio as if proximity could bring her closer to the truth. Hitler's voice filled the kitchen, speaking of sacrifices in the East, and eternal struggle, and the unbreakable German spirit. He spoke for 18 minutes. He never once mentioned Stalingrad by name. He never acknowledged the surrender. He never addressed the families of the missing. When the broadcast ended, Ingrid sat motionless in her chair, staring at the radio as if it had betrayed her. Her government had just told her that her son did not exist. In Berlin, Joseph Goebbels prepared for the speech that would define his career. The Berlin Sportpalast held 15,000 party faithful, carefully selected for their enthusiasm, arranged in precise rows beneath towering swastika banners. On February 18, 1943, Goebbels would ask the German people a question that demanded only one answer. Eva Hartmann sat in the 3rd row, wearing her secretary's uniform and the fixed smile expected of all attendees. Her fiancé had been a lieutenant with the 6th Army. She had received his last letter in December. He had written about the cold, about the hunger, about his faith that rescue would come. Rescue never came. Now she sat surrounded by thousands of strangers, waiting to perform grief as patriotism. Goebbels took the stage like a conductor approaching his orchestra. His voice started soft, building slowly, weaving a spell of words that transformed catastrophe into opportunity. The defeat at Stalingrad, he declared, was not an ending but a beginning. It was the moment when Germany would shed its weakness and embrace total war. "Do you want total war?" Goebbels screamed into the microphone. The crowd erupted in thunderous approval. "Do you want war more total and radical than anything we can even imagine today?" The screaming grew louder. Eva screamed with them, her mouth forming the words while her eyes stayed empty. Beside her, men and women wept with fervor, their faces twisted in ecstatic devotion. She thought of her fiancé freezing to death in a basement while these people cheered for more death, more sacrifice, more war. The camera captured her face for a brief moment, one more loyal German woman supporting the Reich. No one saw the tears. No one knew whose memory she was drowning. 400 kilometers to the east, Colonel Otto Reinhardt commanded what remained of a tank battalion retreating across frozen Ukrainian plains. His orders were clear: hold position, do not withdraw, wait for reinforcements that would never arrive. He had heard these orders before. He had watched the Sixth Army receive these orders. He knew how this story ended. His wireless crackled with contradictory commands. Berlin demanded he defend a village with no strategic value. His divisional commander quietly suggested finding a better position. Between these voices, Reinhardt heard the whisper of Stalingrad, the ghost that now haunted every German officer on the Eastern Front. Obey impossible orders and die gloriously. Disobey and survive disgracefully. There was no third option. Reinhardt chose survival. Under cover of a blizzard, he withdrew his remaining tanks and 400 men to defensible ground 15 kilometers west. The village fell within hours. Soviet forces occupied ruins that Reinhardt's men would have died defending. His commander filed no report. The chaos of retreat buried his disobedience beneath 1,000 other small rebellions happening across the collapsing front. Back at the Wolf's Lair, Werner Hoffmann discovered what his small act of mercy would cost him. Not arrest, the machinery of the Reich was too overwhelmed for that. Instead, his punishment came in the form of a new assignment. He was ordered to compile reports of defeatist statements, collected by the Gestapo, everyday Germans who had expressed doubt about the war. The files arrived in wooden crates, hundreds of pages documenting whispered conversations overheard by neighbors, complaints made to shopkeepers, questions asked at church. A schoolteacher in Cologne had told her students that the war might not be won. A factory worker in Essen had said he hoped his son would not have to fight. A doctor in Frankfurt had questioned whether the official casualty numbers were accurate. Each report was stamped with a date, a name, a recommendation for further action. Werner read through the night, seeing in these files a portrait of Germany that did not exist in Goebbels' speeches. This was a nation of quiet doubters, of secret skeptics, of people who smiled and saluted in public while mourning in private. The Reich was built on compliance, but compliance was not belief. Beneath the surface, millions of Germans were already grieving for a future that would never arrive. Then he found the file with his mother's name. She had told a neighbor that she prayed for peace. Just that, a prayer, a hope, a mother's wish that the killing would end. The Gestapo agent who recorded her words had noted her statement as indicative of defeatist attitude and recommended continued observation. Werner held the file in shaking hands. His mother's life now existed as a piece of paper in a system designed to destroy anyone who questioned the machinery. One phone call could elevate her case. One ambitious bureaucrat could transform observation into interrogation. Her survival depended entirely on remaining invisible. For the first time since he had warned Brenner, Werner understood what his choices really meant. This war would not end with victory or defeat on some distant battlefield. It would end in kitchens and offices and filing cabinets, decided by ordinary people making small decisions that added up to everything. That he looked at his mother's file. The system waited for his response. The machine demanded its gears keep turning. Werner made his choice. The match struck against the box 3 times before it finally caught. Werner watched the small flame dance in his cupped hands, then touched it to the edge of his mother's file. The paper caught slowly, curling brown at the edges before surrendering to orange flame. He held it until the fire touched his fingers, then dropped the remains into a metal wastepaper basket and watched until nothing remained but gray ash. It was such a small thing, one file among thousands, one name erased from a system that contained millions. No one would notice. No one would investigate. The machinery of surveillance was too vast and too busy to track every missing document. Werner had gambled on bureaucratic chaos, and the chaos had swallowed his tiny rebellion without a ripple, but he knew. He would always know. And that knowledge had changed something fundamental in his understanding of how empires fall. They do not collapse in single moments of dramatic destruction. They rot, slowly and invisibly, from 10,000 small acts of non-compliance, from a million quiet decisions to stop believing. The summons came 3 days later. Hitler wanted his inner circle gathered for what he called a conversation about history. Werner arrived at the conference room to find the walls stripped of their military maps. In their place hung portraits: Frederick the Great in his blue uniform, Napoleon crossing the Alps, Roman legionnaires marching toward unknown conquests. The message was clear. This would not be a discussion of current operations. This would be a lecture on destiny. Hitler entered looking like a man who had not slept in 40 hours, because he had not. His skin had the gray pallor of candle wax, and his hands trembled when he gestured. But his eyes remained fixed and certain, burning with a conviction that seemed to intensify as his body weakened. He took his place at the head of the table and began speaking without preamble. What followed was 4 hours of monologue that Werner transcribed word for word, his pencil moving across paper while his mind struggled to comprehend what he was hearing. Hitler did not discuss military strategy or casualty reports. He discussed narrative. He discussed how history remembers. He discussed the alchemy by which defeat transforms into legend. Frederick the Great, Hitler explained, had lost battle after battle in the 7 Years' War. His enemies surrounded him on all sides. Twice he considered suicide. But he refused to surrender, and in the end, the impossible happened. Russia withdrew from the war, his enemies quarreled among themselves, and Prussia survived against all odds. Frederick won, Hitler declared, not because he was stronger, but because he believed longer. Napoleon's retreat from Moscow, Hitler continued, destroyed his empire, but only because Napoleon allowed it to destroy him. If Napoleon had maintained his will, if he had refused to accept defeat as final, history might have unfolded differently. The Russian winter did not defeat Napoleon, Hitler insisted. Napoleon's acceptance of winter defeated Napoleon. Werner wrote these words knowing they were madness. The laws of physics did not bend to willpower. Frozen soldiers did not become warm through belief. Ammunition did not appear because generals refused to accept its absence. But Hitler was not speaking about reality. He was speaking about story, about how the tale would be told in 100 years, in 1,000 years, when all the soldiers were dust and only the myth remained. Paulus had one duty, Hitler said, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. Not to hold Stalingrad, that was already impossible. His duty was to die in a way that would make Stalingrad immortal. 300 Spartans at Thermopylae held against 1,000,000 Persians. They lost. Every one of them died. But their defeat became the greatest victory in Greek history because they refused to surrender. I gave Paulus the chance to become the German Leonidas. I gave his men the chance to become the new Spartans. And he stole that glory from them. He chose his miserable life over their eternal legend. The room remained silent. No one dared respond. Werner looked at the faces of the generals and advisors surrounding the table, men who commanded millions, who decided the fates of nations, who had believed in this vision with their whole hearts. He saw doubt in their eyes. He saw the first cracks forming. Stalingrad had not just destroyed an army. It had planted a seed of uncertainty that would grow until it consumed everything. Hitler stood, signaling the end of his monologue. As he walked toward the door, he paused beside Werner's chair and looked down at the pages of transcription. These words, Hitler said softly, will outlive all of us. The bombs will fall, the cities will burn, the soldiers will die. But words survive. Remember that, young man. In the end, the only thing that matters is the story we leave behind. He left without waiting for a response. The room emptied slowly, men drifting away in ones and twos, each carrying their own private thoughts about what they had witnessed. Werner remained alone, staring at his notebook. 23 pages of words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. That night, somewhere to the east, the survivors of the 6th Army continued their march into Soviet captivity. Of the 91,000 who surrendered, fewer than 6,000 would ever return to Germany. They would die of starvation, disease, exhaustion, and despair in camps scattered across Siberia. Their names would be forgotten. Their stories would go untold, but Hitler's words would survive. They would be studied by historians, analyzed by psychologists, quoted by writers trying to understand how one man's delusions could consume a nation. The story Hitler wanted to tell, of eternal German glory, of surrender as the only true defeat, would become exactly what he feared most, a cautionary tale about the cost of believing in stories more than reality. Werner walked to the window and looked out at the frozen darkness. The war would continue for 2 more years. Millions more would die. And in the end, the Reich would fall not because it ran out of soldiers or bullets, but because it ran out of people willing to believe. He had stopped believing in a basement conference room, watching a man mourn lost propaganda instead of lost lives. He suspected he was not alone.